cause I'm on one.
You know, we have ones that's a Rastafari, live in the city, Kingston City, Manhattan, like you know, we live amongst our universal brothers and sisters, and Rastafari is for each and every one. So it's not a...
Swinging for the fences for the home run.
Habesha, Megusana gets to Ethiopia. Habesha, Mrs. Maya, the Farambasa. Habesha.
Even further beyond into the universe, but I've got to make it to first.
Urgent message from the 12 seers of Mount Zion. They said the black nation will be blessed by God in these days. Circle the mountain and go home. Shabbat, Mount Zion calling me.
All right, and so still here and giving a bit of news coming out of Asia, more specifically Southeast Asia. Before we actually get into the reading of this report here coming from the South China Morning Post, just to mention a few things about Asia, especially with this whole coronavirus crisis or epidemic going on at the very moment that stretches across, many countries as we see at this moment. It always seems to be, quite a few years in between, but we always seem to have some great health scare. I mean, and just for example, we have the coronavirus for this year, marking 2020. Just a few years back, we had the whole Ebola scare. A few years further into the past, we had the swine flu, so on and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I have my own suspicions and my own opinions about a lot of these so-called chemical or biological viruses that happen to, just have a surgence throughout the population of the world at any given time. But, so many things happen in between, those times whenever you have one huge health scare to the next. So it always seems to have, certain streams of accord. But, not to get off on a whole tangent on that, but, just something for ones to think about and also research on their own time. And, something that we'll look to kind of share a bit more, especially on these podcasts and others, is a lot more of the health issues, which we haven't touched. We can't say we've done the best service to many of our listeners as far as that has been concerned. And that was even a suggestion from, one of our own family members, just speaking on some things, casually throughout the holidays at the end of the last year and moving on into the new year as well. So that's, just something that came across our own minds as we were kind of going through a little bit of our reports here. But, again, not to get too far into the woods on that subject matter, but just know that we'll have a lot more to share as far as a lot more health issues and things like that, or moving in those, particular type of categories, and be more ITAL in that sense, especially being Rastafari, as many of our platforms will be Rastafari leaning in that sense. But here, again, just mentioning Asia as this whole thing has, just taken storm over much of the news outlets, especially in the mainstream, and even so some that are more independent and, kind of doing their own thing in that manner. But the South China Morning Post mentions here again, a lot of the effects in which, this great Chinese rise has happened socioeconomically and geopolitically all over the world at this point now. Will have its effects, especially there in Southeast Asia. This coming from a lot of your academics, a lot of your analysts, so on and so forth. Everyone seems to be in agreement on this note as China continues to rise in the Far East. Many other Asian nations will be affected very positively, but also negatively in some aspects, but more so positively as far as things that will be moving on up into this next decade and into the coming decades as far as that is concerned. But here, entitled Asia's Next Clean Energy Battle isn't in China or India, it's in Indonesia. And our two subpoints here, just interesting links here from the South China Morning Post by one Ian Morse. Point one, Indonesia's electricity needs are projected to double in the next 10 years, driven by massive demographic changes in the workforce. And the second point, without prompt action, its reliance on fossil fuels threatens to offset the region's positive growth towards renewables. And so before, just another little point here before we actually get into the reading again, this is what we're seeing as far as this China rise, this I guess you can say a denuclearization neutral area or period in a sense, in what we've seen from the U.S. and Iran and the tensions that have gone on between them, and again, Russia continuing to have its resurgence, all of these great geopolitical standoffs that just so happen to happen, just over the few short span of years. One in particular place that still comes to mind is Syria. And, if one's actually kind of pay attention to a lot of those tensions that go on between the Middle East and the West and the Far East, in that sense, in Eurasia, for, all intents purposes, and all of the, alliances that seem to still be intact and new ones that actually seem to emerge, we see a lot of this shifting still kind of having its part, and the Middle East being, in a sense, kind of the battlegrounds, in a sense. I quote unquote, I use that euphemistically, but yet and still, in many cases, it's pretty much our reality in that sense as well. But all of these things have their play, and many of the adverse effects tend to trickle out, to other adjacent places and countries and nations, so on and so forth. And here, Indonesia being the particular country in question. But of course, other ones mention places like Africa and the tensions, and even so many of the benefits that have come from China's rise in that sense. Many people have their opinions on many different subjects as far as that is concerned, and how things are actually taking place on the ground as they are being reported, whether they're being reported accurately or, are dismembered a bit. But all of these effects just still seem to have, this stream of accord where, it definitely is something happening that hasn't happened so many times before, and even on up through the years until this point. But even so, Indonesia looking to things like renewable energy, solar and aquatics and other, renewable energy sources, and again, looking for that development that really will bring many countries to a place where they haven't been, as far as history is concerned. And this, tends to be the theme throughout many of the developing nations still, because all of them seem to be at the same place or, a similar place in that sense, as far as their development is concerned throughout the whole of their countries, where they may have certain places that are more developed than others. And when we actually take in account the percentages of how many countries have, those luxuries in that sense, or those necessities in place, they tend to kind of, balance themselves out and self-aggregate in that sense, as far as, I guess we could say, the categorization of how certain countries tend to develop, or the time and space that they have that actually brings them into certain levels of modernity. But this, just keeps one's kind of on their toes, and seeing how things are continuing to change in front of their eyes, as far as from the time they were children, certain places, may have not been thought of as, the places to go, or the places where, certain progression takes place. And now they see that these things are completely changing in many instances, and other places not so much. But here, continue on throughout this reading of this interesting post here. Southeast Asia's largest economy and democracy is approaching a demographic shift. In the next 10 years, almost half of Indonesia's population will enter the workforce. Only 3 in 10 people will not be of working age by 2030. Conventional poverty rates are declining. Millions are moving into cities each year. The island nation's labor force will surge, and with it, disposable income and energy demands. The picture is similar elsewhere in Southeast Asia, but while its neighbors have spent years developing clean energy options, Indonesia has not negotiated a new renewable energy contract in 3 years. Indonesia's room for growth means it will be the largest contributor to the region's ballooning energy demand, joining India and China as a global hotspot for power needs. Indonesia, which is Southeast Asia's most populous nation with more than 250 million people, expects its electricity needs to almost double in the next 10 years, tripled from 2010. But its heavy reliance on fossil fuels, the highest in the region, means it may offset the rest of the region's positive growth toward renewable energy. But there's some hope in sight. Indonesia expects an end to stalled clean energy growth in March of 2020, when a ministry regulation aims to attract renewable investment that has so far preferred the welcoming arms of neighbors like Malaysia and Vietnam. It's the deciding year, quote unquote, for Indonesian clean energy, says Fabi Tumewa, director of the think tank Institute for Essential Services Reform in Jakarta. Indonesia's lag behind its neighbors has made much more difficult its goal to reach 23% renewables from 12% in its energy mix by 2025, he says. If you want to accommodate this 23% target by 2025, starting in 2020, so percent of the new energy capacity has to come from renewables, Tomiwa says. Currently, less than 10% of annual added power capacity is renewable. President Joko Widodo hinted last year that reducing coal would become a national policy and has indicated in public speeches that sustainability is a national goal. For the 23% goal to be met, however, the country may also need to cancel coal projects already in the construction pipeline, Tomiwa says. Researchers also note that some grids are already at capacity but continue to see coal development, such as the Java Bali system seeing the addition of a Chinese-owned 2,000 megawatt coal plant. The March regulation aiming to reignite the interest in renewables is expected to address previous regulations that were seen to make clean energy financially unviable. In September, Parliament also has an option to advance the country's first unified renewable energy law that would guide policies on clean development. For Tumiwa, it was the regulations in 2017 that killed incentives for investors to create clean energy projects. Without a renewables law, investors await ministerial regulations that can change multiple times within a year. It was anticipated, says Tumiwa. We already said in 2018 that we didn't expect any new project agreements in 2019 because the regulations are crap, so no one would really like to invest. In a 2018 PwC report, 94% of investors believed that regulatory uncertainty was a major barrier to investing in new large-scale power generation. In 2017, two regulations shook interest in energy investment in the country as they mandated that the state-owned power company, PLN, buy renewable energy only up to 85% of the standard price of energy. What renewables can meet that price? Tumiwa asks. That, in addition to shifting risk management from PLN to private companies, made many projects unbankable. The Indonesian government believes that as a developing country, cheap electricity takes priority over environmental concerns, targeted at boosting the electrification ratio, which officials say now stands at 98%. Although some doubt that figure, Ulrika Hamdi, an energy finance analyst at think tank International Energy Economics and Finance Analysts, doubts that price of coal. The price of coal reflects the true cost. It is often heard from the ministry that coal is cheap and renewables are expensive, which means they can expect renewables to play on the same level as coal. The claim is not exactly right, and coal is only cheap because there are certain costs that haven't been included in the price calculation, Hamdi says. Indonesia does not yet have any carbon tax or carbon pricing mechanism. If we had, like in the OECD countries or the great oil producing countries, for those who don't know that acronym. You can actually look that one up, the OECD, and you'll see many countries like Nigeria, Iran, Venezuela, Angola, so on and so forth. So that's kind of where they're getting with that. But or even in development countries like Chile and Mexico, where they make polluters pay for each ton of CO2 emitted, then all these coal power plants will be paying more. The March regulation will balance the interests of investors who want to build clean energy in the country and PLN, which Hamdi describes as a big old heavy dinosaur, quote unquote. Electricity generation falls under the purview of PLN, including off-grid power across 17,000 islands and remote mountainous hamlets. Legally, PLN retains the rights to manage the end-to-end power sector in Indonesia, from power generation to transmission, distribution to retail, Hamdi adds. However, PLN's capital is limited. Indonesia is so big, so vast, with so many people, it needs a lot of investment. Micro hydropower and solar power, research says, have the greatest potential in Indonesia of all Southeast Asia, but combined make up less than 3% of the energy mix. Small off-grid power generators may be the cheapest way to spread electrification, but PLN has focused on expanding transmission lines. Reaching 100% electrification may reduce the pressure in rural areas to migrate to cities. To ensure laws and regulations accommodate both small and large power projects, Grita Anindarini, a researcher at the Indonesian Center for Environmental Law, says community involvement is key. The country may rush to make up for lost time and neglect the input of civil society groups that would advocate for smaller projects that would be more appropriate for Indonesia's difficult geography, she says. If you look at the scope of regulations, it's not yet apparent how they can make community-scale power available. We need to open up as much public participation as possible. And this is the conundrum, in a sense, we would say on a macro level or the larger scale, looking towards the entirety of a nation or the entirety of a region. In that sense, if one's, actually know the geography of a place like an Indonesia, we would imagine that it is, a great task to manage something, as grand a scale as a very large, vast amount of area and space, especially when there are, so many numbered islands, and so to speak, in this case in question, the question of the nation of Indonesia. And these are, streams of one chord for many developing nations, and also speaking for the times that we're living in now, where many people leverage foreign investment to develop certain nations and bring them to a certain level of modernity. That way they seem to be able to compete and also, create a space and also I guess you can say a home base for their own governmental organizations, as well as those who, intend to partake in that a governmental system. So these are, the adjunct, we can say, preliminary questions in a sense, and the ways of thinking of certain managers of society. And given the time that we are living in now, where so many things are shifting, and the world has moved in such a way technologically so fast throughout the future span of years in the past on up until this point, certain things have changed so fast that now we see things that we haven't seen in certain places of the world that have never been there. And now people are contemplating this whole new world as things continue to change. Though, it hasn't been, the smoothest transition, especially for the majority of countries. And that's not so much just speaking to the developing countries, but also to the ones that are already developed. In question, many countries like Italy, the UK, even the United States, so on and so forth. They are, again, feeling the adjustments of a lot of these changes and a lot of this advanced development going on in, many of the places that had not had, the opportunity to do so, until the few years in the past that we've just seen we pretty much lived through at this point, and that really has spoken to so many notions and raised a lot of questions for a lot of analysts. Not only for the managers of society, but also for many of the governors of society in that sense. And I think that really brings us to not only a point in where these governmental organizations are contemplating these things, these very highly trained, highly lettered analysts, and just experts in their fields of study are actually looking at, but even so, many of the common man, whether that be here in the West, in Africa, or Western Europe, Eastern Europe, or Far East Asia. A lot of people tend to think more and more on these international planes. And this was, even so, our goal for bringing a lot of this information to many of you listening to the sound of our voice at this point now. A lot of things are continue to spin at such a rate to where not only are we contemplating this new world which we're living in now, but the world to come, so on and so forth. And that really brings so much innovation to so many parts of the world that hadn't had this, ever in history. And now we're starting to see the birthing pangs of this new world. And, some people may be comfortable with that and others may not. But for certain, being informed will at least give us the chance to make the decision, whether that be on an individual level or a grander scale within a group or within, a certain neighborhood, within a certain region. We all have the opportunity right here in front of us to learn as much as we can every day. So that way, when certain things start to come, proverbially down the pipeline, ones can actually assess whether they are will be a beneficiary of certain developments, or whether they will be on the receiving end of some detriment. And that, in and of itself leaves a lot of power for ones to make a informed decision. And that, for the most part, is what we intend to present here, and hopefully ones will continue to receive that.